My deep connection to the state of Israel began in 2005. I had traveled to Israel many times, both in high school and with my family, but not until that summer did I really connect with Israel for more than the falafel and the Tel Aviv beaches. In the summer of 2005, I was a madrich for Nifty in Israel. I had the chance to take high school students around the country, exploring the cities, the nature, the history, and the people of the land. That same summer is when I met Josh Weinberg, not yet a rabbi. He was also leading a group of students for Nifty in Israel, and he was the lead educator. During our staff orientation, I remember Josh getting up on that ancient wall of the old city and speaking about the importance of the place that we were standing, but that we should also not only connect with the ancient wall, but also with the vibrancy of the land, a place as Reformed Jews we should call home. He was a captivating educator, and then when he spoke to the entire staff, we listened, as did the high school students that summer too, which is a hard thing to do. He brought Israeli history alive and shared his love of the land and fostered it for those who traveled with him that summer. Now, 16 years later, Rabbi Josh Weinberg is leading our Reform movement as the vice president of the URJ for Israel and Reform Zionism, and as the executive director of the American Reform Zionist Association. And we are so incredibly lucky that he is. Rabbi Weinberg is strengthening our ties and other Reform congregations' ties with the Jewish state. He is fighting for our Reform Jewish ideals in the land and continuing to build that love for our country, for that country. We are so lucky to have Rabbi Josh Weinberg join us this Shabbat to teach us, to challenge us, to deepen our ties to the land of Israel.
Well, Shabbat Shalom. And thank you, Rabbi Prozin, not only for having me for that beautiful and inspiring introduction. And it is good to know that someone was listening all those years ago. And it is remarkable to see your journey. And I don't have to tell your congregation how lucky they are to have you as their rabbi and as their leader, and to take them now into the future. But I will anyway. And that, Ethan, it is so wonderful to see you and to see how you've grown and are now inspiring the next generation of young Reformed Jews, not only in Westfield, but beyond that too. And it is such a pleasure to be here. Your congregation is one of these mythic, legendary congregations of our movement. And as I look across, of course, my good friends, Rabbi Appel, and so nice to be with Cantor Novik. I'm looking out at the Zoom of Rabbi Chuck and Terry Kroloff, who are here, who are one of the giants of our movement, and my good friends who have so many connections here. So people have known me since I was born, like Rabbi Ellen Lewis, of course, and Jeff Kagan is here with us. And I would just say that what Rabbi Prozin said was true, but I would not be where I am today if it weren't for, of course, Rabbi Bennett Miller, who is my mentor and my teacher and my friend. And I'm so lucky that you got to learn some of his Torah over the past year or so, and to share with his outlook and his passion for the Jewish people and for Israel and Zionism. And I want to thank all of you also, because Emanu-El has been one of ARZA's largest supporters for so many years now. And those of you who are members, those of you, how many of you voted in the World Zionist Congress elections? Just show of hands this past year. We could not have done it without you. And what we're going to speak about in just a few minutes, we're going to still need your involvement and your constant action and activity And I'm so glad to be with you tonight at this, what we call Shabbat Para, when we read tomorrow the story of the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf, and explore that chapter in our history. But I want to say something that might be obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. I want to posit that the state of Israel, now almost 73 years old, has been a tremendous success story. It's a story that goes beyond, a Hollywood movie, beyond our wildest dreams, to imagine what we have been able to create against the odds that we faced in 130, almost 130 years of Zionism, and then 73 years since we've had our own state, has been nothing short of miraculous. That doesn't mean that we haven't made our fair share of mistakes. As you may or may not be aware, when David Ben-Gurion and his ilk and the other early pioneers and early Zionist leaders went to declare establishment of the state of Israel, there was no book on the shelf that they could take off that said how to build a Jewish state for dummies. And so we did the best that we could, and not only did we join in with this pioneering spirit where we said, we came to this land, Anu Banu ARZA Livnot, to build the land, Ulihibanot Ba, that we also came to be built in it. And that we've seen not only was building the state of Israel, the modern Jewish state, a project of the entire Jewish people the world round, the state of Israel has now been shaping and forming and creating what Judaism and Jewish life is as we know it today. And so as we approach Israel's 73rd year of independence, there are a few questions that still remain as part of the defining character. Namely, what does it actually mean to have a Jewish state? What does it mean to be Jewish in the Jewish state? The question that we still have not yet quite agreed upon the answer, as Rabbi Appel mentioned in welcoming us all together at the beginning of Shabbat services tonight, is who is, if Israel's going to be a Jewish state, then who is a Jew? And more even importantly, who has the authority to determine who is a Jew? That's why this week's landmark Supreme Court ruling was so incredibly meaningful. Now, some people are cynics and they say, well, look, what's the big deal? It actually only affected 10 court petitions or about 30 or 40 people who are waiting in limbo to have their conversions recognized so that they can claim citizenship in the Jewish state. But I'd like to suggest that this is a significant moment for us. This ruling that the Supreme Court said, no, you as a Jewish state, the state of Israel, has to recognize the conversions of Reform rabbis, of conservative rabbis, and other non-Orthodox rabbis. I'd like to maintain that this is a major step in chipping away at the unbridled authority that the ultra-Orthodox chief rabbinate holds. That this is a moment where one could even say that this is the beginning of a revolution. Now, this ruling did not come overnight. You may have read, you may have heard that these court petitions have been going on for over 15 years. But even before that, this is the same struggle that Rabbi Kroloff and Rabbi Eric Yaffe were fighting in the 1970s when they created ARZA, the 1980s and 90s when they won significant victories. For instance, the ability for Reform and conservative conversions to be recognized from abroad, from the United States, from all over the world. And I want to say that this victory, as we celebrate this week, we are standing on their shoulders. But you see, Zionism is bigger than any single issue. And I want to take a moment to share with you a little bit of my own personal reflections, because my own Zionism had very little to do with the struggle for religious equality or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. it was about the dream of fulfilling our national aspirations. It was the dream of reclaiming our ancient homeland and restoring a sense of self-determination. And for me, as a young Reformed Jew growing up, I grew up just west of Westfield, New Jersey, in a small town called Chicago. And I was a seeker. I was looking for different options, and I realized that for me, that Zionism was actually the answer to my Jewish identity. And I showed up in Israel wanting to be a secular nationalist Jew, bushy-eyed and full of idealism and romanticism. And I said, okay, I'm here to drain the swamps and to work the land. And my friends laughed at me and they said, that's great, but you're about 100 years too late. And I said, okay, so what is Zionism today? What's going to be my expression? Is it enough just to come and live in the land of Israel, or to work trying to inspire young teenagers as Rabbi Prozin and I did together? And the search went on. And fortunately for me, well, maybe you're familiar with this concept. Have you ever heard of a rabbi or a member of the clergy claiming that they received their calling? You're familiar with the concept a little bit? Yeah, okay, great. Well, fortunately for me, mine came in the form of an actual phone call, which is convenient, okay? We have to recognize those modern miracles when they call you on the telephone. And it was a friend of mine on the other line who said to me, he was a conservative rabbi and a good friend, and he said, listen, it says, what are you doing? I said, doing about what? And he said, what are you doing in life? I said, well, I'm teaching young Jewish teenagers on our Movement's High School in Israel program, which, by the way, you should all send your kids and grandkids on 100%. Send them for a semester in Israel and high school, very important. And remember, Israelis are sometimes cynical. And he said to me, he said, look, that's very nice that you're spending your days teaching affluent kids from the suburbs in America. I said, but I want you to try working with real Israelis. I said, oh, what do you have in mind? He said, all right, come with me this Shabbat. I said, okay. And I packed a bag and I joined, he picked me up and we started driving south from Jerusalem and we arrived at the town of Kiryat Gat. Now, it's not on the standard Israel tour trip that many of you might have been in. How many of you have been to Israel before? How many of you have spent considerable time there? Anyone? Any what I call repeat offenders? You go often, and as we like to say, it's not galut if you commute. And obviously many of us are eagerly awaiting that moment when we can rejoin and retravel again to go back to Israel after more than a year for some of us. And so we show up in this town, which was a dusty, what we call a development town, which was halfway between Tel Aviv and the middle of nowhere. And we arrived at the campus of a boarding school. He said, look, I've been working here, a few Shabbats a month, Shabbatot a month, and I want you to help me. I want you to be what they call the Shabbat guy here. I said, what? You want me to be the Shabbos guy? And he said, no, you're the Shabbat guy. You come, you lead services, you do activities with the kids here, and you're like a positive Jewish role model for them. I said, okay, I had been a camp counselor long enough. I said, oh, okay, I can try that. He said, okay, good, you're on. And kind of pushed me out of the car and said, okay, great, Shabbat Shalom. And I go get ready and I make my way to the makeshift Beit Knesset, the synagogue, which was a prefabricated building that in Hebrew we would call a caravan, sort of a small rectangular building. And I see the students filing in, getting ready for Friday night services. And I happen to notice 2 10 or 11-year-old kids breaking out into a fist fight over, it turns out later, was over who would have the honor of passing out the Sidurim. Yikes. And so I was approached by one of their madrichim, one of their counselors came to welcome me, and he said, "Oh, you're the new Shabbat guy." And we began to talk for a few minutes, and he said, "Well, tell me something. Is that a slight American accent that I hear in your Hebrew?" I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I just made Aliyah about 3 years ago here, and I grew up in the States and came to Israel. And usually when you say that to Israelis, they either say one of two or sometimes both things. They either say, 'That's wonderful, welcome,' or 'What's the matter with you? Are you crazy?' Or sometimes both." But he just paused and he looked at me and he said, "Yeah, no, that's not going to work here. These kids are going to eat you alive." I said, well, thank you." Uh-oh. And he said, but don't worry, I'm going to help you. And he said, I'm gonna teach you a song here that we are the only group, we are the only school, the only institution in the entire state of Israel, in the entire country that sings this song. And if you can sing this song, well, they'll think you're one of us and you'll come with, they'll go with you. I said, "Oh, thank goodness for this guy." And he said, "We don't have a lot of time, hurry up." And it goes like this. He takes me around the corner and goes, "All right, listen." And he begins to sing. Shalom Rav, Yisrael Amcha. And I started to laugh. He said, "What? You know that song?" I said, "Of course. Let me tell you, I was the head song leader at Olin Sang Ruby Union Institute in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin, in the United States at my URJ camp." And he says, I don't know what that is. I said, let me tell you something. I grew up just 2 miles away from Cantor Jeff Klepper, and I just saw Rabbi Dan Freelander here in Israel last week." And he goes, "Who the hell are they?" And I said, "Oh, they're the guys who wrote the song." Now, how many of you have ever met Israelis before? Okay. What is the worst thing for an Israeli to be? It's what we call in Hebrew a friar or a sucker. He said, if some cantor in America told you that they wrote that song, the song is actually right here in the Siddur, in the prayer book. I said, no, of course, right, I know that. They wrote the melody. He goes, "Okay, doesn't it?" He goes, "Can you sing the song?" I said, yeah, I can sing the all right, get in there. And he pushes me, into the door, and we get through a rather painful Kabbalat Shabbat, if you remember the fist fight. And very much like we did together this evening, we rose for the Amidah, we prayed the Amidah together, and it was time for a few minutes of silence. And at the end of that silence, I mustered up all the courage that I could and the strength, and I closed my eyes and I began to sing. Shalom Rav, Yisrael Amcha. And like magic, the students all straightened up in their seats, and they stopped pinching each other and messing with each other, and they turned and opened their Siddur, and they were following along, and they were singing and belting out this very loud, very Israeli, off-key version of the same song that I grew up with at camp and youth group and in synagogue. And it was at that moment that it hit me. As I looked out at this crowd of about 60 kids, ages 8 to 18, who were there because their parents couldn't take care of them. They were Israelis from Ethiopia, Israelis from the former Soviet Union, Israelis from Iraq, from Yemen, from Tunisia, from all over. And they were sitting there, boys and girls together, not a given, by the way, praying out of an Orthodox Sephardic Siddur, singing a song written by a Reform cantor and rabbi. And I said, that's it. I said, you see, I'm too late to drain the swamps and work the land like the chalutzim, like the pioneers of a century ago, and I'm no good at high tech and being part of the startup nation as Israel is. And I said, this is it. This is what my Zionism is going to be now. Because while all those things are great, I can help bring Reform Judaism to Israel. I can help reimagine what it means to be Jewish in this Jewish state, because you see, Israelis are now waking up to this reality where the previous polarizing dichotomy between religious or Orthodox and secular no longer answers the needs of the mainstream. You see, Israelis are waking up and understanding that just having a Jewish state doesn't necessarily mean having a Jewish community or even a Jewish identity. I said, that is what this is all about. That is what Reform Zionism is all about, is not worrying so much about the state of the Jews, but helping to create what it actually means to have a Jewish state, to follow the values that we learn in the Torah and apply them to public life. That is the Zionist revolution. And that is what's so exciting. And when we look at it, we know that I came to the conclusion that as much as Israel very much needs Reform Judaism here very much needs Israel. And now, Rabbi Prosnit assured me, and Rabbi Miller also, that everyone at Emanu-El in Westfield reviews the weekly Torah portion at least 15 minutes each night before you go to sleep. That's true, rabbis? I think so, 100%. Great. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Torah portion, but what I want to do is think about this exact moment we are in our calendar year. Because when we talk about those values, we are right in the middle of two of our most important holidays right now. We just celebrated Purim last week, and we are now just a few weeks away from Pesach. Now, you see, Jewish history speaks to our generation in the voice of two biblical commands to remember, that word zachor. Now, the first voice is actually the voice of Pesach. And that voice commands us to remember that we were strangers in the land of Egypt. The message of that command is, don't forget that you were refugees. Don't forget what it means to be a stranger, and don't be brutal. Now that you have power, now that we have power, okay, we must be judged in how we treat the other, how we treat the stranger in our midst, the powerless, the ger, almana, the yatom, right? The stranger, the orphan, and the widow. However, the second voice is the voice of Purim, actually. Because remember the villain of the Purim story, Haman, who is a descendant of none other than the all-time quintessential anti-Semite, Amalek. It was Amalek who attacked us without provocation when we were wandering the desert. And that command to remember is the command to not be naive. To notice that we have to be strong. And that first command is the voice of Pesach, of liberation. And the second is of Purim, commemorating our victory over this genocidal threat. Pesach Jews are motivated by empathy with the oppressed and the powerless. Purim Jews are motivated by the awareness that no matter how strong we are, we still face existential threats. And here's the thing. Both commands, both voices are essential. One without the other creates an unbalanced Jewish personality, a distortion of Jewish history and values. We must judge ourselves if we can, as the ability to create both a Jewish and a democratic state. And if we fail in creating a democratic state, I'd like to maintain that our state cannot also be Jewish. As we take with us those messages of Purim leading into Pesach and looking deeply at these Jewish values of what it means to create a Jewish state, I want us to look into ourselves and ask the question, where do we see us as a part of this? Not us as American Jews, but us as individuals. How are you and everyone coming to this synagogue, to this virtual space, as I look around the squares on this Zoom, how are each and every one of us connected? Because let me tell you something, we need you. The battle that we won was absolutely a powerful victory and a major win for us. But let me share with you the sobering reality that battle, that war is not over. In a few weeks after the coming Israeli elections, you can rest assured that we are going to see massive political extremist forces who will come together with a serious attempt to overturn that victory. That's why right now we need every single Reform Jew to join us, to become members of ARZA, to support our movement, to support our lawyers of the Israel Religious Action Center, to support our Israel movement for reform and progressive Judaism, who's building congregations, building youth movements, changing the face of Israeli society. We need all of you to be a part of this. And I hope that you can join us on this sacred and fateful journey as we see a new light, as we say, Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir, v'nizkeh kulanu meheira le'oro, that this new light will shine upon Zion, and may all of us merit from it quickly in our days. Shabbat Shalom.